Just what you said? It is 1, so I just hit the record button. So you guys are all set to get started. Yeah, I think it's the regular one right here.
We have to 4 chairs? What do we do?
Are we doing 4 chairs?
Yes, and I'll bring mine. I guess I'll just wait until.
It will be visible, is that what we determined?
I don't know that we'll be visible. I think we're only visible for this corner.
Christy, do you want to be the owner of the clicker? Sure.
So we have 4 participants. Okay. I don't know where to stand.
More towards the back. I can see you. Push the chairs
Oh.
back towards the wall.
Okay, is this better?
Allison and Kelly, you're welcome to kind of come up and join. It's awkwardly
Yeah,
us
it's
up
kind of
here.
weird.
So without a mic. And we have a couple of people online, so you're welcome to kind of come up and join us in the conversation. We here are already being recorded.
You can really join us now. Or do like a little.
We could do a circle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is not a way of seeing Anneke. I don't think we can look at that. It's a weird road to do this in, right?
I guess. I'll try to stay focused.
I thought it was more invasive.
Okay, it's 1:02, so I think we have to get started. So thanks to the folks online for coming, and thanks to those in the audience who are here. We thought it was a good idea to maybe take some time during the spring breakout to talk a little bit about the bias prevention response team, but to talk even more about the bias prevention response process and what it looks like, and why it's important, and how it hopefully can be an educational tool for folks. Okay, so we have a very tight agenda because we only have 50 minutes. So I want to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll do a little bit of an overview of the bias response process, and talk about again, like what that looks like on the ground, go through the chain of events. And then we'll do some case studies where we peer and share to actually go through like what a bias report might look like, or some of the incidents that might compromise a bias report, and have you talk in groups about how you might address them and share your thoughts. And then we'll discuss a little bit as a panel, and talk about how we respond in our roles. Jen, being Dean of Schema, has had some experience with this process as well, working with faculty and working with students as well. So her input is really, really valuable as we discuss the case studies, and we really appreciate her coming. So now that I said Jen, I think I'll let Jen just introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Jen Knapp. I'm the Dean of the School of Communication, Media, and the Arts, and I originally come from the Department of Communication Studies.
And I've been talking, but I didn't say my name. I'm Kendra Cadogan, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer and Interim Director of the Transfer Institute.
Christy Huynh, Dean of Students and Assistant VP for Student Affairs, and Kendra and I are co-chairs on the bias prevention response team.
And I'm Anneke McEvoy, I'm whether we're here, Associate Director of the Toronto Institute, and also on the bias prevention response team.
Okay, so moving right into our overview of bias, just a refresher on what bias is and what bias related incidents look like. And I'm gonna let Anneke talk a little bit about that. Thanks.
So if you want to, this isn't going to work for you, resources around unconscious and implicit biases, but something we talk about a lot is that our brains are wired for bias, right? And in some ways they protect us, in some ways they're helpful. One of the things I talk about in workshops, I'm not going to remember the name of the bias, but it's when like someone models something and you decide you should do that too, like bias kind of. For example, you're online and somebody donates to a charity and you're like, I'm gonna donate to that charity too, right? That's not a bad thing. But it also, bias is also what leads us to hire people that look like us, prefer our same gender, or defer to a gender because of the way we've been socialized to see that gender, right? So it's unavoidable. being aware of bias is the most important thing, because you all have them. So bias-related incidents, I'm gonna stand up for a sec. I think I sprained my neck or something. Snoring on. So telling jokes based on a stereotype, using a racial slur to identify somebody in any way, calling a person or behavior gay as an insult, saying this group is like that. You know, I went to a jewelry making workshop with a friend of mine who's Iranian a few years ago, and the instructor kept saying the Iranian people are nomads. The Iranian people love to barter. And I was like, I suggested this weekend. Imitating someone with a kind of disability. I think we remember a presidential candidate who did this before a worldwide audience. Making derogatory comments on social media about anything about somebody, drawing pictures that imitate or stereotype or belittle somebody, intentionally or repeatedly misgendering someone even after being corrected. And I'm always, you know, I had a good friend in high school who came out. His name was Anthony. We've gone to schools together since we were kids. His mom used to pull my pigtails. I used to steal his Nutella sandwiches, and he wanted to be called Nino. And I was like, but you're Anthony, you're Anthony. And I look back on that moment with shame because, you know, he was telling me something that he didn't want to be Anthony, however nostalgic I might have been about that relationship. So we're going to talk about bias incidents that come up and how we can deal with them in the classroom. Something to keep in mind is some of what we're going to talk about is even more subtle. And I think a lot about Title IX, where we get reports that range from, you know what I love to say this, penis on the whiteboard, all the way to really egregious assault. And it's not that the Title IX office will act on all of those, but getting all that information gives us a sense of the climate. So, and not in a punitive way, but in an informative way. So we understand where we need to educate, where we need to support. And I think that kind of message and understanding is the core of what we're going to continue to talk about today. Thank you for letting me stand.
Yeah.
It's hard, it is.
So we wanted to just give a brief overview of the bias prevention response team, the purpose. So the team is comprised of myself, Christy, there's some other folks, maybe 4, 5, 6 other people. So it's pretty representative of the campus community. But really folks who are very involved in student affairs, people who obviously are going to be involved in conduct, issues of sexual violence. So that's kind of the umbrella that's thank you, the community phone. That's kind of the umbrella of coverage right now that BPRT is comprised of. But really what the team I think has been working on, and Christy has been a great leader in this, is helping the campus understand that bias prevention and response, particularly the prevention piece, I think is really everyone's responsibility. So we really try to work on moving from a kind of centralized, maybe a little bit siloed model of like prevention response to like, here campus community, here's the work that we're doing, here's how we really need you to be involved and engaged, and here's why it's important. So there are some key core things that we do. We really coordinate response to bias incidents, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. A lot of incidents really do require a coordinated response because sometimes we're dealing with students and staff, or students and faculty and faculty, whatever, right? There are different unions, there's HR, there's conduct, there are parents sometimes. There are all of these players that, you know, we need to be mindful of and coordinate between. Again, we really are trying to create a climate where we're actively monitoring and then creating opportunities for education to cultivate equity and inclusion. So again, when you think about bias, all the things that Anneke read off, you know, that could be considered bias incidents, really what we want is to make sure that people do not feel marginalized, that people feel like they're included and that they belong here, right? Like we've been talking about belongingness a lot this year, which I think is really, really good. We got a lot of great data, thanks to IR, from our students around belongingness this year. So we really want to make sure that the campus is a place people feel like they belong, and the bias prevention response team, the opportunities that we create for education and the initiatives that we're working on should help cultivate that kind of environment. We're also working on leading more into restorative practices. So we're talking about like facilitating restorative conversations between parties involved in bias-related incidents. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. It's important to know that the process is not a punitive one. It's really an educational process. There are, of course, compliance issues and conduct issues and sometimes legal issues, but that falls outside of the purview of our particular process. Like, we're really trying to make sure that the practices that we engage in are restorative, and it's not about being punitive in any way. Protecting folks, but not being punitive, to be clear. And then again, you know, we are continuing to assess our efforts to assess campus climate to really help inform how we move in the future. What's next on the horizon? You know, how can we better impact climate? We're talking in our next BPRT meeting about new faculty and staff orientation and how we might be able to share information there in a way that helps incoming faculty and staff understand how serious we are as a campus community around our inclusive community priorities. So again, like I said, the process really is educational, and it's designed to positively impact the climate through interventional and proactive measures. So it's not just the response piece, it's also the prevention piece that's really important. And Christy, I'm gonna ask you to definitely help me with this slide a little bit, because you know all the numbers and things, but just Christy keeps great records of all of the reports, you know, that we've been working on, and I counted it up last night, and we've responded to at least 51 reports in AY 22-23. So that's quite a lot of work. And 51 doesn't necessarily seem like that big of a number, but when you consider that there's at least 2 parties involved, at least in every report, and again, it can be anything from students to, you know, faculty, to UUP, to CSEA, right? Like, there are a lot of folks that are impacted, but what it really means is that at least 100 people, maybe 101 or 2, my math isn't that good, but at least 100 people know that they can come to us and trusted us enough to say, hey, this is something that's happening to me. I don't know if it rises to a level of legal concern or to a level of student conduct concern, but it made me uncomfortable, and I want to talk about it, and I want to know, like, you know, what can be done. We've had folks that have reported things and said the things that haven't impacted them personally, but they've said, like, well, I saw this happening and I want to make our campus community more inclusive and a better place. I want my kids to be able to come here and feel comfortable. So I felt like it was my job to bring this forward and just give you this information, see, you know, what kind of education can be done around it. So I think we're doing a really good job of getting the word out and making sure that folks feel safe and comfortable and know that they have a resource if they are experiencing instances of bias. And I want to say too, that confidentiality is essential to the process. So even when we were putting this presentation together, and I'm gonna ask to chime in, but even when we were putting this presentation together, one of the things that we said immediately was like, we have to make sure we highlight how important confidentiality is. And Anneke, I'm gonna ask you to share what you shared in that conversation that kind of blew my mind.
So the reports come directly to Christy and Kendra. We review them anonymously together as a committee. I don't know who any of them are. Like, unless it's something that's in my area or as a student that where I'm engaged in some way, but I don't know anything about the faculty and staff reports. I don't know any of the names. And even because it's a very surface report that we kind of check in with just to get a sense of numbers and the types of, I'm fuzzy on the details. Like, you know, it's just this kind of language was used, or this incident happened. And I think that's important and I know that this, you know, folks from Res Life and Housing were on the committee. Of course, they know about the incidents that are happening in Res Life. Again, I'm not over there. So, so I think I think that's something that concerns people when they're reporting or when they're engaged in the process. It's embarrassing. So, you know, does this mean these 12 people know that this thing happened? And it doesn't. So I think it's really important to emphasize that. I'm going to add one thing, kind of along the same lines. because, you know, we all know Lisa in Title IX, and I worked with Lisa so closely, and one of the pluses of that process historically has been we have an entity attached to it. We have a person, and it's one person, so we know it's not 12 people, right? That said, you know, working with Lisa, we're aware that it's a lot, you know, and one of the ongoing conversations is how do you take a process, a need, and make it not about a person, but about the process? So how do we take all the good things that we've learned from Lisa in her process and make it something so that when Lisa, is she retired in 6 years? Did she ever mention that 5 or 6 years? But, you know, so how is it something inevitable, sustainable, intentional beyond a person? You know, how can we emulate all those good things? And it takes 12 of us. So.
I think a little bit about like, so the chain of events, right? Like if a bias report is submitted. So when the reports come in, they go to Christy and I. And typically if it's a student and a faculty member, or a student and a staff member, then I might be the one to reach out. Usually when there's students, Christy reaches out. And there are a number, I think this is up here. There's no one size fits all approach, right? So depending on the situation, or the situation determines what my response is going to be. The situation determines, I think, what Christy's response is going to be. Sometimes it's just reaching out to a complainant or to a reporter to say, thanks so much for sending this. Please let me know if you'd like to talk further, right? Because maybe they've said, I just want someone to know this. I don't necessarily feel the need to follow up. If it's something more involved where maybe like a student is saying, this is something that happened to me and I didn't know who to talk to, then Christy is going to reach out and say, hey, let's schedule an appointment, let's talk. Or, I mean, Christy, you have so many resources, Dean of Students Office, so a ton of places that students can be forwarded to. If there are any instances of like sexual violence or anything Title IX related, that's something that typically like Lisa Anneke, Title IX office is already going to be aware of a lot of times, particularly if there's been any like police activity or anything like that, or if there's any conduct related stuff, right? Like it's already kind of on there. So there's a number of avenues that a report can go in, but confidentiality and what the complainant or the reporter is asking for is always our top priority. So we don't move unless we get confirmation from a complainant that they want movement, right? Like we only reach out to people that a complainant feels comfortable having us reach out to, right? Like on their behalf. So for example, if I get something from a student in media, I'll say to the student, okay, like, what would you like the next steps to be? And the student might say, oh, I'd like to talk to somebody, but I don't know who to talk to in the department. So I'll say, well, you might want to talk to the department chair, or you may want to talk to Jen Knapp, right? I've worked with Jen, she's great. She handles these situations really well. She's a confidential resource. You know, would you like to do that? The student says, yes, great. I'm gonna connect them to Jen. If the student says no, I'm going to leave it alone. Now I may reach out to Jen and just say like, hey, there's something happening, right? I may not give details about the student or the faculty or whoever it is that's reporting, but I want Jen to just be aware that generally there might be something going on in her area that she needs to know about. But again, with the understanding that it's very, very important that we keep people's information confidential, and that to the extent that we are permitted by law, we are only sharing the information that people want us to share. I think that's just really, really important to emphasize. And I'll kind of fly through the rest of these because I know we're already at 1:20. I said this before, but it's really important that folks realize too that these reports that we get really do serve as data points that help us map out what the campus climate looks like. And eventually, you know, we should be able to use all these data points to figure out what the interventions are or what the processes are that we need to implement so that we can push the climate to, you know, wherever we're trying to take it. If it needs to be more inclusive, you know, if it needs to be more LGBTQIA+ friendly, or, you know, whatever, like that's the direction we need to go. And all of these reports really help us understand what's going on out there in the campus. And there's other data that we can get and that we do get, but these reports, I think, also give us information that's really important in that often, because there is the opportunity for anonymity, at least to the extent that like only 1 or 2 people would ever necessarily ever know that you reported anything. Like this really does help us get a better understanding of some of the like underlying currents of like uncomfortableness or like maybe ickiness that exists that we want to identify and stamp out. And then we also, the bias prevention response team has been working on developing education materials. So we just, in collaboration with the Office of Communication, or yes, with comms, we just did the LGBTQIA+ pronoun website. We also put together a traveling workshop around pronouns. Anneke and I went to the Spectrum. Yes, the Spectrum conference, and got the idea that we should put together a pronoun workshop based on one of the workshops that we went to at the conference. That was really, really great.
Yeah, something quick.
Yeah.
So we can take the show on the road.
Yes.
Yeah.
And take the show on the road is really what I want to say about this bullet point. It's important that we don't create materials and expect people to come to us. Like, we want to go to department meetings. We want to go to President's Council. We want to go to student organizations. We want to go into res halls or wherever and share this information, because we realize that people aren't going to come to us all the time and say, hey, like, I need help with pronouns. Can you provide some guidance? Like, we also need to repeat it constantly, so that it becomes part of the campus culture. So people understand that this is something that should be on my mind, right? Like, I should be thinking on a daily basis about being mindful of people's pronouns, right? Doesn't mean that I'm not going to make mistakes necessarily, but it should be kind of top of mind, just like I would be mindful about wanting to know someone's name and calling them by that, right, when I see them. So I think more educational materials and resources probably to come.
I just had a question.
Yeah.
So in April, I know there was the news article that came out, and as a faculty member, seeing that, I was like, I read it and I had seen it on the news and things like that. And then I had heard more in faculty assembly from Liz about, what was being done.
Oh, okay.
But
I know what we're talking about.
yeah.
I mean,
So-
Trace Trump,
Or are you talking about
In
the
April,
student?
the student.
The student, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And then as a faculty member, I hadn't heard anything about it. So then seeing it on the news was like, oh my goodness, this is happening. And then in FA, Liz Schmidt had given us more information, like, a lot is being done, and then, so I wouldn't have known that. And it makes sense, like, things have to be confidential and things are happening on the back end. And a lot of times as faculty, we don't know that. So having that, having more education materials or having, that dialogue with like faculty, other than just seeing it, it's going to be great. And like to see those things, just because I was like, whoa, did you guys see that? I didn't know this was happening. And seeing it in FA and hearing, yes, there is other things. Don't take everything, like that was good to hear, because, otherwise I was like, oh, I didn't know this was happening.
And to share, so we were working with the LGBTQI+ working group all
Yeah,
spring.
right.
So Christy and Kendra came in just to answer questions, and it was amazing. Like, it just, and to get feedback on response, it was useful, constructive feedback. It wasn't, no one came, the knives weren't out. It was, if this would have been helpful, that would have been helpful.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's such a good point. And what I took away from it was that we have to find a way to be a little more transparent in our communication, even when there's literally lawyers involved, and
Right, I can imagine
right?
it's hard.
Yeah, there's
like,
there's
with it being
so many
confidential. Yeah.
layers of things. But what was disturbing for me was just the idea that faculty or staff or anyone on campus might actually believe that it could be possible
Right.
that we as an administration had acted in the way that we were being accused of, right? Like, to me, that's like, okay, then that means that we're failing a little bit in that communication, like we have to do better. And we also need to be thinking very intentionally about our campus climate, because again, if you believe that these things could happen, to me, that's a bellwether for where we might be climate-wise. Yeah. Jenny,
No, I wanted to give everyone up here credit for the work that they've done, and one of the things that I said to them in planning the workshop is that you need to celebrate your wins. So I mean, this is really only 1 year of a formalized process, but I think to your point, Jessica, the sort of symbolic role that this process and form really even exists, I think is important, because it shows anyone who has been potentially victimized or a victim of bias to know that there is a place for them to go, and that it's going to be taken seriously, and that people are, going to be held accountable in some sort of way, usually as an educational conversation, which we'll talk more about later on. But I think even that is really important to show people, particularly students, that we're not just going to be like, well, that's my buddy, and I'm, sad that you don't like them as a professor and not deal with it. But there's actually a process for dealing with all these things, and it's something that we're. Yeah,
I have to say, for a couple of years, we were in orientation promoting report biases, and I literally had a kid look at me and say, and then what happens? And I didn't have a really good answer. I mean, I could speculate about what I hoped would happen. But now, while it is still a very responsive process, therefore it's a dynamic process, it's not like A, B, C, D, I can give scenarios of what might happen and genuinely be informed by the fact that they are happening.
Yeah.
So.
And
Yeah.
then,
And to say too, I think the dialogue has just opened up a lot since I've been here from 2015 to now. It's just totally different and evolved. And, I feel like faculty are more involved in the process and we hear more about what's happening too. So I think that's been beneficial too, as working with the students, knowing where to go ourselves.
That's-
Even though we used to have our sheet to like where to go, but like it's just, like we know the people, we see you, like it's helpful.
that's very encouraging. And I'm still laughing a little bit, Jen said my buddy. But I think that's an important point because, and back to Anneka's previous point about the kinds of infrastructure that we're building, right? By assessing all these processes and really focusing on our bias response, like we recognize too that we need to provide more support to leadership as they work to develop employees and to hold folks accountable, right? Like, and it is difficult. And I think Oswego is a very close-knit community, even in that, like, there are literal like family ties, right? Like everyone knows someone who has a husband or a wife or brother or sister, aunt, uncle, grandparent, right, that works here. And so it can be difficult sometimes, I think, to navigate some of these issues. And this process and processes like it that we're thinking about and trying to create infrastructure for really help us make sure that we are able to hold each other accountable in ways that are useful, right? And educational.
But in the name of having a climate in which people feel
Right.
safe and
Exactly.
supported.
Yes,
That they
yes.
belong.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not necessarily accountable in an HR.
Right, no,
Punitive sort of
yeah,
way, but just sort of, we are all part of this community. We want to make sure that people are sort of having the fullest experience.
Yes, yes.
And I think we use the data, which, we don't necessarily celebrate, oh, we got to 51 reports, but in a way, we do celebrate it in that we understand and know, right, that these experiences are happening and people are feeling these things and experiencing these things. And so are they doing that alone and feeling like they have no voice, or are they doing that knowing, oh, I have a voice, I have a support, I have access to resources. And so we're really trying to build that so folks know that they do have that, and be inclusive that includes students and faculty and staff have that support on both ends, right, in terms of having made mistakes and having kind of experienced these things. And so I think we see that as a positive, and I think we also take ownership as a committee around this information and knowing this is experiences that are happening in our community, and that we want to kind of provide some leadership in terms of, kind of moving the needle as we've talked about. The other thing I'll just point out is, these reports come in through a formal reporting process that we have in terms of a form that's online and easily accessible. They also come through emails and they come through conversations. And so I think the strength of having the team and having lots of folks on there is that there may be someone that someone feels comfortable coming to and bringing something forward to in a less formal process, maybe through an online report. And so I think that's the strength of having a representation from across the campus, but also to have an awareness even to the community. So we've had reports that have come out through community members who are not, necessarily even affiliated with the campus. And so they have an avenue in a way to share that. And we actually had, an incident that took place that we had multiple reports come in terms of people who had been impacted. And so I just feel like that's what we want to create. We want to create a space, obviously, ultimately where these things aren't happening, but that, people feel like they can report that and get resources, and that we can then work on some of the prevention and education, for ourselves. So.
Any other thoughts about this?
Do one more thing.
Go ahead.
I'll make it quick, but, and you talking about the sheet and, you knew, but even still, and I shared this with the group the other day, this spring, in the process of working with the LGBTQI+ working group, I had 2 people who I know work closely with Lisa, know Lisa, tell me about incidents where I was like, tell me, because they were like, this thing happened, and they were not of it, they were just telling me officially report, and I was like, you gotta report that, like, that's definitely a reportable thing. And really just kind of pondering that, like, the resources there, I know the folks I was speaking to were aware of and value the resource, and in the moment, you're kind of caught up in the, what happened, and I think sometimes even forget there's a place to put that, like, there's a place where that can go, so.
Okay, so we're gonna move into our case study and panel discussions. And I think originally, I know we have some folks online, originally we were gonna have folks pair up and read and pair up and maybe share a little bit, but unfortunately cut into your pair sharing time. So I think maybe we'll give folks a couple minutes to just read the case study, and then we will have some discussion here, kind of unpack it. Yes. I'll just turn around. Oh, and I have this. One more minute.
So we mentioned that these are, names have been changed, and
Oh,
some
yes.
have been adjusted, and
So yeah, so these are not actual incidents that have been reported as much as they are themes that we've seen.
Campus.
Yes. Okay, so moving into our panel discussion, I'm sure everyone that's read this has thoughts, right? And I feel like for me personally, when I'm reading it, things are a little uncomfortable until we get really to the last sentence. I'm like, oh, okay, that took a hard left. It just already wasn't going so great to begin with. But I want to talk a little bit up here about what would happen if a incident like this came into us as a bias report. So if it was, well, whether it was submitted by a Maxian or whether it was an email or a phone conversation, it would come to me in some way, shape, or form in Christy, right? And I would then reach out, assuming that the student, right, was the one that reported. I would reach out to the student and say to the student, hey, like, I'm really sorry, first of all, to hear that this happened to you, that you're feeling really uncomfortable in your class, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about what's going on, if you're open to that, right? I don't think, I mean, we had very minimal cases in which students are not open to, I mean, we've had some in which students just aren't necessarily responsive. Sometimes there's some conduct pieces mixed in with that, but typically students are just really glad that someone reached out. And
I'll just add,
Yeah.
there was one student who didn't have anything specific that they experienced, but in light of some other things that were happening, kind of putting forward some general thoughts that they had. And, I had reached out, immediately and didn't hear back from the student for months. And then at a point when they were in a different place and they actually reached out and we actually met. And so sometimes it isn't immediate and sometimes they don't have more that they want to offer. But oftentimes they will, and they'll follow up and we have the opportunity to provide that support and have that conversation.
so, if I can get in contact with a student, I'm gonna meet with the student in the way that's most convenient for them. If they want to meet in person, and sometimes students do want to meet in person, then I'm gonna make every effort to fit them into my schedule in person. If they'd rather meet on Zoom, I'm gonna meet with them on Zoom. Typically, when we're having conversations with students, we're really just trying to get a better understanding of what happened, get some more details, get an idea of who the folks are involved. And then one of the questions that we always ask students is, what are you looking for out of this process, right? Like, what would you like to see happen? Of course, explaining to students that there are absolutely limits, right? Like, if this is a restorative process, it's educational, it's not punitive, like we're probably not going to be thinking about firing anyone, right? Like, that's not a conversation for us in this moment. I've only ever had one student that was like, I'd like this person to be sanctioned, like the only one. I don't know, Christy, if you've had more.
We've had some who, the students have a sense of, what they would like to have done. And sometimes it's not, it doesn't rise perhaps to a violation of student conduct, for instance. And so it wouldn't be, sometimes it does, and that would be a referral there. And so, yeah, you do have to talk about kind of the parameters and the options kind of that they have.
And what we do also always explain to any complainant is that we're going to do our best to close the loop, right? So we're always going to make sure that we close the loop so that they know that we've reached out or they know that we've made whatever the next step is. But we also are clear that we're not always going to be able to be completely transparent, right? Like, we can't always tell you what every outcome is because there's another party on the other end of this process that has rights, right? So, and the right to confidentiality, particularly if employment is involved. So, and I think students in particular have been always very good about understanding, like, okay, there's some guidelines here, like.
Is there encouragement for education or professional development sessions like self-workshops in these situations, or AQ? I'm just thinking of AQ, how it's a great credential to have and gives specific examples like these and videos when I went through it, and there's great like reflections and actual implementations for faculty to really kind of throw in that. And I don't know, I know it's not something probably on campus that we can force faculty members to do, that's voluntary, but just ways to like kind of encourage more education about the topic. Is that something that's able to be done?
Yeah.
So this is exactly the thing that came to mind. So, I'm here today to sort of talk to you about what it looks like from my side and what happens and what my role is if a report were to come in. And one of the recent reports that we had was ultimately just sort of the choices that the instructor was making and how those choices in sort of the material that the students were working with was uncomfortable for some of our students. And one of the first things that came to mind was, wow, I wonder if this person would benefit from going through the AQ program for sure. So I think while it's not an official, doesn't have an official tie to this process, I think that's sort of the value of having deans in the conversation, whether it's a dean or associate dean, is to sort of understand, you have that educational conversation with someone and you sort of realize how they got to that point or why the situation even occurred. It might just be that they didn't know to think about, or they've always done it this way, which is something that we do faculty say all the time. I've been doing this for 30 years. It used to work. I don't know why it's not working anymore. There's new ways, there's new methods, there's new information that we have about neurodiversity, whatever it might be. So I think it would probably be up to the dean potentially in an academic affairs case to maybe make a suggestion like that.
Yes. So I'm glad you jumped in, Jen, because I was gonna say, it's 100% up to the dean. So that's another piece that's important, I think, for people to understand with this process. We really provide support to complainants and we provide them with resources, but we do not sanction, we do not step in and manage issues related to employment, right? That's where our partnerships with our deans and campus leadership are super, super important. So Jen is a great dean. She knows what she's doing. This student comes to me and I talk to them. I'm going to say to the student, hey, like, I'd really like you to have a conversation with Jen or with the chair, you know, and 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, me, the student's gonna say, yes, I would like to talk to Jen. They go to Jen and then Jen really manages whatever the personnel response looks like. We really, as a BPRT team, don't have a hand in that. Unless, say, you know, Jen comes back and says, well, my faculty member might like to have a mediation, right? Or if a student has asked to have a mediation with a faculty member, I would still reach out to Jen and say, you know, this is what the student would like. Can you find out the faculty member would be open to that? If the faculty member is open to that, then that might come back to us as something. So we might manage the mediation, but we do not manage like the HR personnel pieces. So Jen, I think it would be great to, you know, like, I'm sure you can identify multiple places in this case study in which you might have done things differently. Like what would the conversation that you might have with a faculty member who's been reported look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably start with some sort of empathy statement to say, like, I understand what you were going for here. And because I talk the way I talk, I probably would say it very much that same way with a faculty member. But like, let's talk through how this could be problematic or why it would make a student feel different, othered, you know, whatever phrase you want to use. But I think what's important to me about this process, or I think the value that I find in it, is that even knowing, like, if I know that I'm going to be having a conversation with a faculty member or a staff member or something like that, I'm not doing it by myself. So I think one of the other sort of benefits of having an actual process is having this team around you that I could go to Kendra or Christy or Anneke or someone else on the BRPT team to say, do you have any suggestions for how I would approach a conversation like this? You know, as a new dean, there's going to be lots of situations and scenarios that I've not yet encountered, and I have no schema for, no reference point for to kind of work through all of those things. So I feel like very much it's not like, well, here's, you know, toss something in my lap and then I'm abandoned to deal with it on my own. And then later there's a report that I need to fill out to say, yes, I had this conversation. You know, none of that is happening. It's a very collaborative experience.
There's a thing that I want to add that I think is also, especially when we're talking about non-punitive, right, educational, but I've observed you in this process. I had a student that had an issue with a faculty member, had a concern, felt that kind of a dimension of their identity was impacting what their classroom experience, you know what I'm talking about? And I sat with you with the instructor, and the first step that I observed was actually exploration, that you explored the situation with the instructor. And I think it's important to share that again, because it's not about being called on the carpet and, you know, because you support your faculty, right? So the first step is kind of checking in on what was your experience in the situation. And so we didn't talk about it even in planning, but as you were talking, I thought, I watched that and I know that's step one for Jen. And it should be step one for anybody. As you said, it is with students, you know, come in and tell us the story. But I think, you know, we talked in planning about how challenging this is for folks in their job and in their work to feel that a report has come in from over there and they're going to go in and talk to the Wizard of Oz. Right. But really understanding that the starting point is, you know, what was your experience? You know, I think is important.
And I think it's important to note that, you know, you mentioned the word trends in a different context, but I think a trend that I've noticed, and thankfully, I want to be clear, I've not had to respond to many of these, these reports, but the ones that even just sort of drawing on past experiences that they were incidents of bias, and we just weren't talking about it, coding it the way that we're doing now, is that there's always a very sort of predictable response from both the students and, in my case, in the faculty. First of all, the students, almost to a person, will say, I'm fine. I just don't want this to happen to someone else, which I think is wild. They say that so much. They're not so concerned, or they've sort of worked it out, or they've decided that they can persevere, but they don't want another student at some later point to be made to feel the way that they felt, which I think is pretty awesome and very awesome too. On the other side, talking to faculty members, it's very much, it can be embarrassment, it can range from embarrassment to just sort of being genuinely and fully upset to know that they made students feel that way. Because again, to a person, our faculty are very kind, supportive people. And maybe no one's ever told them that this phrase, or commenting and calling someone out and saying they're a model for their race, gosh, that sounds nice. I'm really trying to compliment you, to know that that is just something that a student could find really offensive and problematic. And so I think from the faculty perspective, there's always a lot of immediate sort of reflection on what happened in a range of emotions, embarrassment, anger, sadness, whatever it might be. But then I think very often we'll always have the same conclusion, is that I don't want students to feel this way. I don't want to make them feel this way. And so it is truly educational in that respect.
You look like you might be about to say something.
Oh, well, I think of something different now, but what I was gonna comment on before was, like you mentioned how the process is restorative and students can say what they'd like to see happen. And I was thinking in my mind, like, you know, if they think something is unfair, they always have like the hierarchy of like going to the professor and then the chair and then the dean, but I like how that you connect them right to the dean so that they don't have to feel like there's all these obstacles that they have to like spend their time and emotional energy on. They can just have the conversation with
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think, yeah, I mean, and sometimes it is appropriate to have it, and it's more of a department chair level kind of thing, and you can, but at least they can sort of tell that story. I can filter things, and we can get them connected to the right.
Or sometimes I think, Jen, you met with, but I'm sure you've met with chairs and students at the same time, right? Like, and it's just it's really nice to have these partnerships particularly with the deans, because like you said, their involvement helps eliminate so many barriers for students. And oftentimes students are tired, or they have a lot of other things going on. Right? It's not just this one class or this one professor, like this one instance. So they have so many other things going on. And sometimes it's just very easy for them to say like, oh yes, I will be glad to meet with the dean and the chair and just kind of get it all done, right? Like, if we can just do one and done. Lisa Anneke is on the vice president response team, and Lisa and I have met with the dean and the chair, right, about a case, so that a student didn't have to do the meeting with me and meeting with Lisa and meeting with the chair and meeting with the dean, right? Like, it's,
Just drop out now.
yeah, exactly. Like, and I think that's one of the strengths again of this process, is that we are trying to eliminate barriers. We're trying to streamline things so that they're not so draining and difficult, not just for students, but for like anyone, because this process isn't just for students to report about faculty or other students. And it's really not for people to report about people as much as it is for people to talk about their experiences and to find some relief from those experiences, or to get resources in mediating conflict. Like, and I think that's honestly what a lot of this work has been about, like people who need help mediating conflict and don't know like where to start or where to go. I think it's worth noting that if this was like a faculty and faculty or a staff and staff, whatever issue, that's something that the affirmative action officer, who's also on the BPR team, would respond to, right? So, and the first response again would be an idea of, let's get more information. Please tell me your story. Let me get more details. Let's talk about how we can maybe like how we can fix the problem without escalating necessarily, right? Like if folks do want to escalate to HR or a union, that's certainly their right. We never tell people, no, don't escalate. But we hope that we can lean into restorative practices and that we can start with conversation and mediation and maybe even a little bit of introspection, empathy, that can go a long way toward not having to then, go straight to the chair, go to the dean, go to the union, whoever. So do folks have questions or thoughts about this case study? Because we do have another one that we can. Oh, are we? Oh my goodness. Oh, I did. Oh, I did so bad. I thought I was doing so good, but I wasn't. Bad. Well, let me just say really quick, thank you all, first of all, so much for coming. And this is just a resources slide. Would we be able to, we can send this out to participants, right? So the resources, we can actually just send this PowerPoint out, and the PowerPoint has a link to a more in-depth PowerPoint if you want to know even more things about bias. And then these are some resources that we pulled together that might be helpful to you in your daily practices. So thank you all so much. Thanks, panelists.
I have another question. So I'm in a role that's new to me, and I supervise students now, like student staff. And I had to have a conversation with a student about something that they said, and some like behaviors they were exhibiting in a group setting that I felt could be marginalizing the other people there. I don't think they were aware of like what impact their actions could have been having. So I wasn't really sure how to approach it, and I was kind of like caught off guard at the thing, like, so I like wish I would have like addressed it in the moment, but like I knew I had to go back to it. So I talked to like a couple colleagues about, all right, how do I talk to the student about this? And I don't think it was something that like I should have like necessarily reported to the team, but could I use the team as a resource for how to talk about it?
Yeah,
So
you sure can.
would I just not necessarily need to fill out the report, but just call?
Send an email. Yeah, absolutely. And we don't get all our reports all the time through Maxian either. Sometimes people literally do just send an email or call. And sometimes people don't really, well, let me be careful how I say it. People are not necessarily thinking to themselves, I'm submitting a report, right? Like they're just sharing information. And in cases where whatever information they're sharing is concerning, then I'll reach back out to them and be like, hey, like, would you be comfortable with submitting this as an actual report? So we have it as a data point, right? But just saying all that to say, you can email, call, whatever, text, whatever is easiest, yeah. And I think, I mean, we do have a website, but this is a good conversation because we do need to think about the kinds of resources that we want to add. And we know that giving folks tools to have difficult conversations is one of the things that we really need to look into. And I think our dialogue project that Anneke is heading up is really kind of focusing on that. And so, yes, exactly.
I was gonna say that, like with that scenario too, just having open dialogue for staff, faculty, everybody.
Yes, and restorative practices, particularly like the practices of like talking circles, I think are a step even before dialogue, right? And that is something that as a campus we're also leaning into. Kathleen Kerr has done a lot of great work kind of making us aware of restorative practices and then giving us opportunities to do workshops and stuff. So anyway, I think that those are the kinds of resources that people need in classrooms and in their offices and just around campus, because it's not necessarily like having conversations about race and identity and ethnicity, how difficult things. Sometimes it's just literally like, how do I address this really weird, uncomfortable situation that isn't okay, but might not rise to the level of like discrimination or like racism, right? So I think eventually we'll probably have more resources on our BPRT website and other places related to
And
that.
it's reacting in the moment, which I think is but you began with, this is new to me, right? This is what maybe. And I think a lot about, as a former teacher, I remember being asked in one of my first job interviews, I did not get this job, being asked about classroom management. And I was like, I'm not afraid to check in with parents, of course I would call them and get to know them first, this very kind of surface, managing. And the administrator was so nice, and I did get my next job because he said this to me. He said, really what we're looking for there is what are you planning in the classroom so you don't need to be calling parents, right? Because I know you're a great teacher. So I think it's even helping folks with difficult conversations, rolling out resources, but also doing the work over time. So we're all getting intentional and understanding how to be intentional. And I know you are already thinking next time I train on the group, there are some talking points that maybe now I know, like we're gonna, and that's exactly what first in the process.
Yes, that's setting some of the words.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important piece, but is a piece if you're not thinking about, right, or haven't had that
Yeah.
experience in terms of really the prevention. And it could be in a classroom and it could be in leading and managing, folks. But yeah, what are those, parameters in the beginning and ground rules and expectations and kind of proactively having some of those discussions. And we have, I think we're on the cusp of providing some better tools and resources on that for everyone. So thanks for the question. And I think it, reiterates to us, the importance of being able to provide that for folks too, because there are some great resources in terms of, sample things to put in your syllabus and kind of conversations to have right at the forefront of, trainings or classes. That I think we can all benefit from.
We had one of those talking pieces from restorative.
Oh, yes.
You can't talk unless you have the mark.
Now you know.
It's a practice and it makes a lot of sense.
No,
Oh, I have the clicker still. Thank you. Thank
We
you
do
so
also
much.
have physical handouts.